or any people, like, I guess, who uh yeah, I don't know, just public figures that you follow that you think have good ideas, things like that.
Yeah, well, I guess it might. I mean, in terms of like just watching YouTube or something like that, right. I've always. I mean, I get something. I have to say, I get something from Sam Seder and the Majority Report.
Yeah.
Vaush. I mean, I do consume a lot of that. I like the serious like engagement, even when I do have disagreements.
So if I asked you who is like the most famous American neo-Nazi or far-right figure over the last, I don't know, 7 years, you would probably pick either Nick Fuentes or Richard Spencer. Now, Richard Spencer has seemingly gone quiet for a long time, but that's what the purpose of today's video is for, because it seems like he has followed his pal, although I don't even know if they were friends, Lauren Southern, in a big rebrand, and now is more, I guess, moderate, is now not a neo-Nazi, is now not really associated with the alt-right. They have like a new political perspective. But as we're going to see in the video, it seems like he has taken a page out of Lauren Southern's book where he will say he's different and he will say he's put some of that behind him. But in reality, the only thing that has really changed for both of them, in my opinion, is they are both far more vague about their specific political beliefs on certain things. And why is that beneficial to them? Well, they probably saw most alt-right figures were being deplatformed on everything, so it makes sense to rebrand your image in some way so you don't get cut off from all social media platforms. With Lauren Southern, I made a whole video about this. She said she'd change, but then she was platforming Afrikaner rights groups and these far-right Afrikaan activists in South Africa. She obviously made that whole white nationalist propaganda documentary about apparently a huge rise in racially motivated killings of white South African farmers. I've debunked that a couple times in a couple videos because during this period there were actually less racially motivated murders of white South African farmers, and although the murders were at a low, most of them weren't racially motivated at all. But if you go on Richard Spencer's Twitter profile, you'd be mistaken for thinking he is pretty much some run-of-the-mill American liberal. And although there is a saying, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds, I haven't really heard of the saying, scratch a fascist and a liberal bleeds. And pretty much what it seems like to me is that because Nick Fuentes has taken over as the leader of like the alt-right in America and the far-right in America, he's kind of become bored of it. And I also think Richard Spencer's far-right ideology was more justified by like pseudoscience and Nazi intellectuals, where people like Nick Fuentes don't really have this foundation. It's more about just being like a total fascist, having like these knee-jerk opinions, loving 4chan, meme culture. Because Richard Spencer had this ideology, I feel like he felt quite alienated by the new generation of Nazis. And as we're going to see in some video clips of him talking about his supposed like political changes, it seems like he hasn't actually really changed. It's just the alt-right that have changed. So what we're going to do in the video is look at Richard Spencer today, look at some of the things he said recently on interviews, look at his Twitter profile, and then I want to contrast that with his leadership of like the American far-right and alt-right. And I will leave it up to you as well. Do you think this is a person who is both changed or is really capable of change, considering how long they were like this American fascist and just how deeply they believed this stuff, only to suddenly turn around, vote for Joe Biden in 2020, and then just act on Twitter like a run-of-the-mill liberal? So before we get fully into the video, please like this video. So in the comments, I guess for today's question, whose political evolution do you feel is the most insincere? Because we've seen this a lot on YouTube. For example, I made a video about Hunter Avallone. There's, of course, Lauren Southern. There's a lot of far-right people who've transitioned into both being liberals or trying to grift as liberals. So let me know down in the comments Whose political evolution do you just not buy? Also follow me on social media at the Kavernacle, on Twitter, on Instagram. Check out the subreddit in the description. Also consider becoming a patron. I'm trying to build up as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible. The benefits of which are getting access to the Discord server and getting access to my Nintendo Switch friend code. Also check out my second channel, the Kavernacle Extra. For every 5k, we get a new chocolate orange. Like I said in the last video yesterday, I'm still waiting for the toffee chocolate orange to complete the pyramid. But yeah, I'm moving to Vietnam. The pyramid is not coming with me. But let's see how far we can get in my sub count before I go. So before we look at this interview that Richard Spencer gave a couple months ago on YouTube, I want to just look at his Twitter account first and just talk about him basically positioning himself as just a typical liberal. So this tweet just made me laugh. He posted himself voting for Joe Biden, saying, "I voted straight Dem. In referenda, I also voted for the expansion of gun rights in the state and against the expansion of marijuana legalization. To hell with libertarian ideology. I'm a libertarian when I want to be." So if you just look at his profile, he has 71,000 followers. He has a dark Brandon meme on his header. He has an American flag, an EU flag, and a Ukrainian flag. I mean, of course, with America and Ukraine, you can understand, I guess, why a fascist would support them. The EU's a bit more interesting, considering that most alt-right, far-right movements in Europe are actually against the EU. But he is also like a massive simp for supposed European civilization. So maybe that factors into why he supports the European Union. So writer, publisher, and speaker. And then it's just really bizarre to read his tweets. So then you have Tulsi hosting Tucker Carlson and him saying, "Since Russia Today went down, we've been really bereft of the traitor's perspective on events about Tulsi Gabbard. I wonder if it's the Saudis or the Russians Trump sold the country out to." Talking about the recent FBI raids on Mar-a-Lago, being that all the Trump sycophants are suggesting that the FBI is planting evidence, it's pretty clear that the FBI found something important. Also, unless I'm mistaken, Trump could declassify almost anything while in office. So why didn't he declassify documents he wanted to take with him? Did he want to sell the classified docs? And also, he's just posting a lot of dark Brandon memes. So you see the laser eyes. And you have some nice infighting here. So Lauren Southern tweeting, "See you all on Timcast shortly." And Richard saying, "Lauren has learned some hard lessons from her experience with Trump-era grifters. She is now linking up with serious journalists, people like Tim Pool who definitely aren't con artists." So responding to Glenn Greenwald's meme about the old left versus the modern left, and Richard saying, "It's almost like white liberals are adults who can govern a modern society and make decisions regarding war and peace, and not whining children who yell 'screw the establishment, my freedom' when faced with any social or political question." And again, this is more bizarre, calling out Chris Rufo, who's the guy who basically invented this critical race theory hysteria, and he says it's called race baiting, man, and it's been the dominant electoral strategy of Republicans for almost 60 years. To be fair, you have innovated a bit with CRT, but it's actually really simple and doesn't require this recondite terminology to understand. Calling out the new leader of the alt-right, Nick Fuentes, his shtick is to offer an over-the-top clownish Nazi secret fantasy rendition of what GOP voting conservatives are already thinking. In this way, he reveals how MAGA now understands itself Christian nationalism. Probably not surprising he's simping over the Northman film too. Honestly, going on his Twitter is like literally insane because he hardly even acknowledges that he was like the face of American Nazism for like, I don't know, 4 years. And when he calls out other people, he acts like he isn't or slash wasn't in his head exactly like them. It's really bizarre. But also, this was an article I saw recently that Richard Spencer listed himself on Bumble as politically moderate. So the author Laura Bassett saying, "I wasn't expecting to have a borderline introspective conversation with the white supremacist leader Richard Spencer on Tuesday night, but a Jezebel reader spotted him on the dating app Bumble in Dallas, Texas, and sent me a few screenshots of his profile. Upon viewing this profile, I thought maybe this is a catfish, so I obtained Spencer's phone number from a fellow reporter and asked him myself if this was his Bumble profile. 'Yes, that is I,' he responded. 'I'd appreciate you respecting my privacy. This is obviously not newsworthy, I'm simply living my life. That would be a fair point if the data in question were not a literal white supremacist leader accused of physically abusing his ex-wife and masquerading as a random moderate skier who's into electronic music on Bumble. So I said as much to him and I thought he was being deceptive, and here's what he responded. Yes, I understand that a person being on a dating app isn't newsworthy. I think the fact that a literal white supremacist leader lists his politics on a dating app as moderate, though, is kind of interesting and a bit deceptive. He says, I'm not a white supremacist leader anymore. The entire right hates me. The feeling is mutual. On basic issues, I'm pretty much a liberal, gun control, abortion, etc. I don't lie or deceive anyone. I didn't realise that. Are you still a white nationalist? The notion of listing my politics as conservatives makes me cringe. It's complicated. I'm not a white nationalist. Spencer went on to tell me that life experience and intellectual rethinking have caused him to reconsider the white nationalist views that he embraced earlier in life. To reiterate, this man coined the term alt-right. The Southern Poverty Law Centre calls him a kind of professional racist in khakis. He was also notably punched in the face by wearing a Pepe the Frog pin in 2017. If you're on a path that leads nowhere, you have to rethink things. So Amy Spitalnik, Executive Director of Integrity First for America, said Spencer is just trying to avoid accountability amid a lawsuit he says has financially crippled him. He is a defendant in our lawsuit against the organisers of the Charlottesville violence. In November, he was found liable as part of a $26 million jury verdict. He's been putting this "I'm a moderate now" thing for years. Like with some of the other defendants, it just appears to be a way to try and avoid accountability. So if you're not as familiar with Richard Spencer, don't worry. We are going to look into when he was happy to be interviewed by anyone and tell them his very explicit and very detailed ideology, which was white supremacist. But yeah, like this article was saying, it's interesting how he's positioning himself as a moderate. And keep this in mind as we go through all the clips I'm going to show you and read quotes from him throughout this video. I basically think because Richard Spencer is an atheist and has some sort of ideology which is grounded in racist, fascist political theory, he basically just doesn't like the modern alt-right because it strayed way too far into Christian nationalism. And when you have people like Nick Fuentes and Marjorie Taylor Greene as like the faces of this movement, and remember like the Anglo-Saxon caucus and all this stuff, I think because Richard Spencer thinks he's like a genius and thinks he's really smart, I think this automatically turns him off the whole movement, and now he's trying to find some sort of relevance. Him grifting more as a liberal is a bit surprising because a lot of his views I think would still find a home in more rational, or I guess just like less insane American conservatism. Like honestly, a lot of his actual views aren't too different from stuff I hear on the Daily Wire. But now let's get into him in his own words. There's a couple clips I want to play for you. So he did 2 interviews with a political streamer called Stardust. Now, I think these streams have some value in seeing how he's trying to position himself. Although I would say I do find it a bit odd how friendly these interviews are and how much they essentially are just a platform for him to convey himself however he wants. And if you go and watch these interviews, you will notice a pattern of him being extremely vague in some ways, so he can kind of get away with his still racist far-right beliefs, because as I'm going to show you with some clips, it's pretty clear that this guy, despite kind of cosplaying as a liberal, really isn't a liberal. Again, I don't like liberals. I think liberalism inherently has a lot of Western chauvinism and some racism as part of its ideology, but again, I still don't think it's anything like what this guy believes in. So I'd probably put this in the title of the video, but probably the most bizarre part of it was he said he watches Vaush and he watches the Majority Report.
Yeah. Okay. And so who are do you follow any current like thought leaders right now that you think that people should pay attention to? Or any people like, I guess, who yeah, I don't know, just public figures that you follow that you think have good ideas, things like that.
Yeah, well, I guess it might, I mean, in terms of like just watching YouTube or something like that, Right. I've always, I mean, I get something, I have to say, I get something from Sam Seder and the Majority Report.
Yeah.
Vaush. I mean, I do consume a lot of that. I like the serious like engagement, even when I do have disagreements. Like I can actually learn from someone who's making an argument and not just speaking in platitudes or being shrill. And
Mm.
so, yeah, I consume a lot of that. I actually didn't know about you until we talked about a week ago or so. So I'm going to
Mhm.
check your stuff out.
Oh boy.
Um,
So that's pretty funny. And I know a lot of you in the comments will quickly say, well, I hate Vaush, he's like a racist and stuff like this. So it's no wonder Richard Spencer is a fan. And although I've made my own videos about Vaush being like racially insensitive or not understanding a lot of things with race, like I made that whole video about him back in the day talking about how black nationalism was the same as white nationalism, and I was responding to that. I still don't think you can argue that people like Richard Spencer, who believe in like race realism and all this stuff, are like the typical Vaush and Majority Report fans. Like, I'm not doubting he likes the content and stuff like that, but I still don't think he likes it because he's massively ideologically aligned with people like Sam Cedar and Vaush. So I don't know how this next bit's gonna go. I don't know if I'm just gonna show you a couple clips all together and then respond to them. I'll stop after a couple and then respond to them. I'll see after I'm watching them right now. But basically, what I want to show you with these clips is that Richard Spencer is not a liberal. It seemingly still believes pretty much everything he used to believe, including race realism, basically the belief that race is a real thing and not a social construct, and it affects many things. Things like, you know, IQ, for example, stuff that Charles Murray wrote about. Richard Spencer very much does believe in this. But yeah, let's get into more clips from his interview with Stardust.
I certainly was, like coming from white nationalism and so-called race realism and so on, which is not necessarily any form of nationalism. It's just a way of taking these things seriously. You can think of, Charles Murray and people like that. I definitely not reneged on certainly the race realism thing. I think race is an important scientific category and is highly predictive and interesting and can illuminate various subjects. I do think that I think a big problem with white nationalism and race realism is the kind of, first off, a kind of so what question, in the sense of, well, we can agree that race is a real biological category that came about due to thousands of years of fairly recent evolution, of human evolution. So it is what it is, but so what? What does that mean? Is that actually motivating to people?
Yeah.
It's an important question.
Yeah, it is.
I don't know if I'll ever escape my shadow, so to speak. And so, and I don't, I want to offer serious criticism of my past, but not a kind of denunciation. I don't think anyone would believe me or take me seriously if I just went like, oh, hey, y'all, I'm a liberal now. Why don't you join my Patreon and I'll de-radicalize yours? I'm not doing any of that kind of nonsense. And, and there's no question that my opinions are going to go against the grain and rub some people the wrong way. It's who I am. In terms of a redemption tour, I would also say this. I do want to contribute to discourse in my own small way. And so I think a lot of my detractors are like, oh, Spencer's a liberal now. He voted for Joe Biden and he believes in the COVID lies and he supports Ukraine or whatever. That's fine if you want to believe that, but I would stress to you that my opinions on these matters are absolutely sincere, and I do want to contribute to discourse in whatever way that I can. There was when Charlottesville. I mean, I'm very conflicted about it because it's like there were a lot of absolutely good and legitimate people who went to Charlottesville. There were a lot of people who were at the height of enthusiasm and were, including myself, who were just like, oh wow, we're winning. This is a new world. We're the mainstream now. It's just this excitement, enthusiasm that was short-lived and maybe misplaced. But there were a lot of bad people who went to Charlottesville, and you can't. What did Trump say? He was like, well, there are good people on both sides. Well, there are bad people on both sides. Antifa are genuinely, maybe some few exceptions, genuinely just nasty folks. Just white nationalism or populism. I think they're dead on arrival, to be honest, because they're not. And again, serious discussion of race and genetics and evolution. Of course, I'm interested in that. But whether that can be compelling or motivating or offers any kind of actual answer that is legitimate to a spiritual crisis that is recognized actually by the left and right, I don't think it cuts it.
Do you think that there are certain races that are inherently better? Do you think that races should stay together, or have their own places? I guess that would be my question.
I do feel, as I said before, there's a natural tendency to congeal into groups, and that these are largely racially and certainly linguistically and very often, maybe even most powerfully, religiously defined. So we are part of a group and we evolved as a group. And so I think that is just an absolute reality that you have to get at. I don't think that, the existence of Notre Dame Cathedral or the existence of Napoleon, and I'm thinking of France here at the moment, and the Mona Lisa, I don't think these are just like irrelevant to the fact that that Europe is a coherent racial body of white people. So, I mean, I don't think that this is just culture that just so happened to crop up at a point. I think that's absurd.
Here. Why did you agree to speak with a brown woman about these things? So, yeah, I don't know if you wanted to answer that, but.
Well, I don't see color, so I don't. Yeah, no. I'm more than happy to speak with anyone.
So listening to that, do you get the vibe that this guy isn't still a fascist, right? So obviously mainly talk about the race stuff. So he believes race is a real thing, and basically his problem with white nationalism, it seems like from the clips I showed you, is more that it's not politically viable anymore because it's too divisive to a lot of people, especially in America, because the notion of who is white or not is actually quite complicated to a lot of these Nazi types. Like in the American context, a lot of American fascists don't actually give a shit what your background is. If your skin is white, as long as you're not Jewish, then you are considered a white person. But more European white nationalists do not feel the same way. To European white nationalists in Western Europe, if you are from Eastern Europe, you are not a white person. If you're from Greece or Spain or Portugal or Mediterranean countries, you are not a white person. If you're from the Balkans, you are not a white person, based on their views of things like history, the Ottoman Empire, Muslim caliphates in Spain, obviously the Asian influence in places like Russia, different things like that. So it seems to me Richard Spencer still very much believes in a racist worldview. He just realizes pretty much he's not going to get anywhere talking about that. And I do find it interesting the way he counterizes Charlottesville like it was just like a big, meeting of the minds with some psychopaths on both sides that turned it into this horrible event where one person was killed and loads of leftist people were injured by Nazis. And I think it's interesting, probably the clip I showed you last, about him talking about European civilization and the Notre Dame and everything like this, believing it's like a symbol of this like European culture which has sprung up due to the European white race. I always find it really interesting, of course hilarious, as someone who makes a lot of content debunking fascist views of European history, that I think Europeans have always considered themselves like one group of people, even like Western Europeans. But also hopefully you get the vibe that this guy is just very, very vague about his racist views. Like, if you watch a lot of what he's saying and you're not politically minded, maybe it doesn't jump out at you as much, like especially him talking about how he hasn't changed his views about race realism, and he hasn't changed his views about things like Charles Murray. So he essentially hasn't changed his views that black people are inherently inferior to white people. So I have my problems with this interview, and the stuff I didn't show you was basically him talking about Russia and Ukraine, and he's like a massive supporter of Ukraine. And I know some of you get butthurt when I talk about Ukrainian Nazism, but even if you think the Nazi thing is a massive minority in Ukraine, they still have people like Bandera, they still have things like Azov, they still have certain groups in the military outside of Azov who wear Nazi iconography. And of course, I don't need to tell you that a lot of Nazis absolutely hate Russians because they believe them to be these Asiatic hordes and they don't consider them European. And we've actually been seeing a lot of liberal racism against Slavic people during the conflict, depicting people like Putin as like Genghis Khan, really reviving these old Nazi tropes about the Russians. So again, it seems that his views on the war are kind of compatible with his old fascist beliefs, although I would say it also wouldn't be surprising to see someone like him take the side of Russia. But if you're grifting to be some sort of liberal, then of course it makes sense to take the side of Ukraine and put the Ukrainian flag in your bio. And when he talks about things like France and Europe, then maybe you can see why he supports the European Union as well. So that is how Richard Spencer is trying to portray himself to the world now. He is more liberal-minded. He's kind of distancing himself from the alt-right. He's distancing himself from white nationalism as a central ideology, although he is pretty much still a self-described racist. And you guys can decide if you believe him changing at all or not. But now I want to talk about his past and his views. Can we keep in mind this guy is in his 40s as well, and he's had a long time to form his ideology. So what I want to do now is go into his history since about like 2016 and basically all the fascist shit he's said. And you let me know if you think this guy has changed down in the comments. So 2016, let's party like it's 1933. Inside the alt-right world of Richard Spencer, Washington Post. We need an ethno-state, he said in 2013, so that our people can come home again, can live amongst family and feel safe and secure. How he was asked in a nation with more than 100 million black people, Asians and Latinos, could a whites-only territory be created without overwhelming violence? Then at last he offered an answer. Look, maybe it will be horribly bloody and terrible. That's a possibility with everything. Spencer, of course, would expel Muslims from his ethno-state, and most women. He said, as he was being driven from the hotel to his next appointment, women would return to their traditional role of bearing children. His attitude towards women and minorities made his admiration for Tila Tequila, the Nazi-loving Vietnamese American, surprising. Would he allow her in her ethno-state? There's always exceptions, I guess. I'm a generous guy. So another article by Graham Wood on The Atlantic called His Conf, which is from a guy who went to school with Richard Spencer and actually interviewed him during his rise as this fascist leader, is really, really interesting. So I find this thing a bit interesting from the profile. Richard Spencer saying, some people in the alt-right are kind of like, women go back to the kitchen, gays go back to the closet, like everything was great in the 50s. I don't believe that at all. The concerns of conservative Christians don't interest him. He doesn't mind gay marriage and he favours legal access to abortion, partly to reduce the number of black people and Hispanics. Smart people are not using abortion as birth control. It is the unintelligent and blacks and Hispanics who use abortion as birth control, he said recently on altright.com's YouTube channel. So remember that little bit he said about Europe in the interview. So Spencer told me that his Volkgeist he advocated was that of white Christendom, a group with indistinct geographical borders, like the European Union, I guess, but roughly including European peoples from Iberia to the Caucasus who were Christian as of a few hundred years ago. I proposed that his understanding of white European culture seemed arbitrary. It ignored the divisions that European identity movements found crucial. He suggested that any concept of identity could be knocked down if over-analysed, and over-analysis would only lead to inaction. The importance of identity creation for Spencer cannot be overstated. It is why every black on white rape must be portrayed as the ravishing of all white womanhood, and every Syrian orphan who moves into an American city as the general of a colonising army. I asked whether I, as someone who is half Chinese but had a classical Western education, would fit within his group, and he hedged impishly, I'm a generous guy. If you truly identify with our people, I would not have any problem with that, but there were genetic deal breakers. A full-blooded African, no matter how wonderful he might be, I'm not sure that would really work. For the 2016 election, Spencer wrote on Twitter, forget the polls, we have a candidate for president who's demystifying racism and the financial power structure. No matter what happens, I will be profoundly grateful to Donald Trump for the rest of my life. At a Trump victory party in Washington on election night, Spencer was spotted hooting and running about giddily. He had hoped that Trump's candidacy would be a small step towards the mainstreaming of his ideas. In a single evening, his timeline skipped a decade ahead. The long-term goal, Spencer says, is the establishment of a post-American white ethno-state for a slow process of awakening ethnic pride and instituting government policies that reflect a new white race consciousness. Spencer believes that Hispanics and African Americans have lower average IQs than whites and are more genetically predisposed to crimes, ideas that are not accepted by the vast majority of scientists. When pressed about what really sets whites apart, I think there is something within the European soul that we haven't been able to measure yet, and maybe we never will, and that is a Faustian drive or spirit, a drive to explore, to dominate, a drive to live one's life dangerously, a drive to explore outer space and the universe. I think there is something within us that we possess and that only we possess. Again, sounds very much like the last clip I showed you of his recent interview. And then, of course, in 2019, audio tape reveals Richard Spencer is, as everyone knew, a racist. So the audio, Spencer's rant from Charlottesville, is about a minute long. In the tape, Spencer expresses his ire at the city of Charlottesville and at those he perceives as responsible for why Unite the Right became the death knell for the rising alt-right name, namely Jewish people and mixed race people. The audience can be heard saying yeah, so I'm just going to read it for you, unless I can find the clip somewhere.
Like 100 times. I am so mad. I am so mad at these people. They don't do this to me. We're going to ritualistically humiliate them. I am coming back here every weekend if I have to. Like, this is never over. I win. They lose. That's how the world works. They get ruled by people like me. My ancestors enslaved those pieces of. We're gonna win. I rule the world. Those pieces of get ruled by people like me. They look up and see a face like mine looking down at them. That's how the world works. We are gonna destroy this town.
And then just on the subject of Charlottesville, jury finds rally organisers liable for the violence that broke out in Charlottesville. Richard Spencer, Jason Kessler and Christopher Cantwell, as well as other neo-Nazis, were ordered to pay 9 plaintiffs in the civil trial millions of dollars in damage and punitive damages for physical and emotional injuries for the Charlottesville rally. Spencer represented himself, called the trial a weapon against free speech, and this was only in 2021. So under the aesthetic of a Ukrainian flag on his Twitter handle, under the aesthetic of dark Brandon memes, and pretending he hates Donald Trump for liberal reasons, pretty much lies the same ideology underneath the surface. The only difference now is that Richard Spencer probably sees white nationalism as he envisioned it as something that is not going to get any, I guess, political momentum, because the white nationalism that is currently mainstreamed in the Republican Party, I guess, isn't the same stuff he believed in. And although he likes this like Christian unity of European history, he doesn't like American Christian conservatism. But his massive simping for Europe, the European Union, him still believing in race realism, and how he believes race is biological and it's very much real and it determines what you do in life. Like how he used to think, not that he still thinks, that Latino people and black people are more predisposed to crimes based on the colour of their skin, and obviously facing millions in punitive damage. It just seems like a guy who both wants to stay politically relevant for his own ego, but also does not want to be as inflammatory because he actually needs money now. And just like Lauren Southern realised, and she was banned off Patreon for her alt-right activism, he realises, like a lot of other alt-right people, unless you're someone like Alex Jones or Nick Fuentes, who can bring people in to your own platform that you create, you need mainstream social media to make your money grifting as a liberal. So if you start talking about how you still are a fascist, how you're still a white nationalist, how you are still a huge racist in very explicit terms, you know you will get quickly banned off these social media platforms. But if you frame it as, you know, I kind of still believe in race realism, I kind of think Europe is like a great idea worth fighting for, I don't really want to die on the hill of like racial division, but I still basically believe everything I used to believe, I just think it doesn't have political traction anymore. I don't think this guy has changed too much. Not that I need to tell most of you who've watched this, but always treat people coming over to the left who used to be neo-Nazis, fascists and far-right types with huge skepticism, like I do. But if they're people who have made massive YouTube channels of this stuff, or if they're people like Richard Spencer who have led fascist neo-Nazi rallies that get people killed and probably brainwash so many people into fascism as this leader of an alt-right movement, obviously do not think he's sincere, especially as you delve more into it and realise he actually does pretty much believe everything he used to believe. He's just not going to be as explicit about it. He's going to keep it vague so he can keep grifting. And just like Lauren Southern, who does this too, fundamentally, they do have very similar beliefs. They are fundamentally still far right. That is just something that is not viable on platforms like Twitch for Lauren Southern or for platforms like Twitter and other things for Richard Spencer. So that is it for the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.